Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Building the Republic Part 1. In this presentation, we're going to talk about primarily the presidency of James Monroe and some key things that occurred during that presidency. There's a lot more that happened during his terms in office than we're going to talk about here, but we're going to start with four key ideas. We're going to talk about the Monroe Doctrine, the Rush-Bagot Treaty, the Adams-Onís Treaty, and the era of good feeling. We're going to start out with a discussion of President Monroe himself. President Monroe was an interesting character and is thought of as the last founding father to actually fill the office of president. His presidency lasted from 1817 to 1825, and actually during Madison's last term, he was convinced to run against him, but he really didn't make any effort to win. Him and James Madison were good friends, so he was just kind of, okay, I'm here, running against Madison, but not really. And Madison, of course, ended up winning a second term. He won that primary and won the second term. James Monroe served in the Revolutionary War. He actually started his service he was a college student when the war broke out, and he very, very quickly joined the Revolution. He was a member of the Continental Congress. He was a U.S. Senator, Governor of Virginia, diplomat to France, Great Britain, and Spain under several different presidencies, including George Washington. And he also served as Secretary of State under President Madison. What not a lot of people know is that he actually helped get the Bill of Rights through as well. As a Democratic Republican, he felt it was important that the people's rights be protected. A lot of stuff happened under James Monroe's presidency, some of which we're going to talk about in this presentation. Other aspects of his presidency, you should view my PowerPoint lessons that are posted on my website. The Monroe Doctrine is a central facet of the Monroe Presidency and dominated U.S. foreign policy for quite some time after he left office. My students are going to learn about this more in class. And so my students, if you want to check out the lesson that we're going to work a little bit with, you can go to the following link. That's the lesson that we're going to use. We're going to explore this in class. But just to give you a brief breakdown of what it was basically a policy directing Europe not to intervene in the affairs on our side of the world. So whatever colonies or territories they had at that point, they could keep. But if they tried to get any more, the U.S. was going to step in and stop them. He said, listen, you stay out of my face, I stay out of your face, you stay on your side, I'll stay on my side, and everybody will be happy. But if you think you're going to come over on our side anymore, then we're gonna have a problem. And that was the basic concept of the Monroe Doctrine. And as I said, we'll learn more about this in class. There were two key treaties that were put into effect during President Monroe's presidency. Okay, there was the Rush-Bagot Treaty and the Adams-Onís Treaty. We're going to talk about the Rush-Bagot Treaty first because that one happened first. On 1817, the treaty was signed. It was a treaty between the United States and Great Britain. Okay, it was one of the first acts of Monroe's presidential term. It regulated naval armaments on the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain, which of course is in the northern part of the U.S., right on what is now our border with Canada. And this was after the War of 1812. It was part of the negotiations post-war. It demilitarized the border between U.S. and Canada and created the longest east-west boundary. This is very important because that current east-west boundary that's in the northern part of the United States between us and Canada, that's still in effect. And that started with the Rush-Bagot Treaty. So that's very, very important. And if you want some more details on that, you can go to the source down here. It's the James Monroe Museum, okay? And you can check that out if you'd like some more details on that. The next treaty we're going to talk about is the Adams-Onís Treaty, and that was signed in 1819. This one's really important for Florida students because this is how we become part of the United States. So let's take a closer look at that. The Adams-Onís Treaty made Florida part of the United States. We paid Spain $5 million to get a hold of this, and Texas was officially a part of Spain. We renounced any official claim to it, so we now no longer had a right to Texas. Now, that didn't stop Texas later on from wanting to become a part of us, but that's a story for another unit. Spain also gave up the Northwest Territories, so this was a very, very important treaty for us. Let me shrink this one down and increase the size of this map over here, because this will give you a nice visual of what this treaty did. So you can see that this shows the area that was claimed by the U.S. before the treaty and then the results of the new agreement. So you see over here, this is This color here, this tan color, that represents the United States. Then this peachy color represents the U.S. territories. The red line represents the new boundary line that the treaty established. And then this area with the little dash marks in it right here, Florida, that indicates the area ceded by Spain. So this gives you a visual of what this treaty actually did to the U.S. So this is very important. It also gives you a sense of what the boundaries were after the Treaty of Paris and also via the 1818 treaty. So this is very, very important to note. The era of good feeling. Everybody talks, oh, it was so wonderful, it was so lovely. Basically, the key reason it's called the era of good feeling is because we had one-party control. So the idea was there weren't a lot of partisan politics and bickering back and forth. The Federalists were out of commission, so they weren't, coming up and causing any problems. It was basically Democratic-Republican dominance, which is why it's known as the era of good feeling. And as you can see, this interesting book by George Dangerfield over here, I've got a copy of the cover, and he describes it as America comes of age in the period of Monroe and Adams. That would be John Quincy Adams, between the War of 1812 and the ascendancy of Jackson. The election of 1828 is going to be very, very important as we move into the next unit because that represents a distinct break from what was occurring in the country previously. So the era of good feeling is basically just talking about this period of relatively calm politics in the sense that you don't have a lot of bickering between a lot of different parties. You basically have uniform control of the Democratic Republicans because the Federalists overplayed their hand with their opposition to the War of 1812, and so they kind of went the way of the dodo. And that's essentially the era of good feeling. So what did we learn? We learned about the presidency of James Monroe and how he was the last founding father to actually sit in the presidential office. We also learned about this important foreign policy development called the Monroe Doctrine, which said to Europe that they should keep a hold of what they have currently in the New World, but if they try to take over anything else, we'd come get them. We would stop them. So that's unacceptable. Can't do that. Then we talked about two treaties that were really important. The Rush-Bagot Treaty, which was particularly key. That was one of the first acts of President Monroe, and that established the east-west northern border of the country. It's the border we still have today. We also talked about the Adams-Onis Treaty, and the key significance of that was that it gave us Spanish Florida. Florida is now ours. We relinquished any claim to Texas, although Texas would come back to be somewhat of an issue later on. And then we also learned that the era of good feeling was basically a period of time where we had one-party dominance. The Democratic Republicans were in control for all of that time, and the Federalists had, by this point, gone the way of the dodo. They were no longer a factor. So from the perspective of partisan politics, it was a very calm period, even though there were quite a few interesting items that occurred during President Monroe's administration. I hope this presentation was useful, and I hope you learned what you need to know, and I'll see you next time.